Spacefarer. Welcome to WTUFO. I'm Caleb Mayo. This show is brought to you by you, the viewer. So thank you for supporting us on patreon.com/WTUFO, patreon.com/WTUFO. Also, you can do that on YouTube if you can figure out where, and Buzzsprout, likewise, using your research skills. Patreon.com/WTUFO or YouTube or Buzzsprout, depending on how you'd like to support us. As little or as much as you would like to per month helps the show continue to exist. So thank you again for bringing us all WTUFO. We really appreciate your support, and we're having a great time making the show. What the UFO? I'm here with Ralph Blumenthal. Ralph, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, great pleasure, Caleb.
Thank you. The honor is all mine. I'm sure those of you listening are familiar with Ralph's name because he's broken some of the most important UFO stories in the past few years, along with his partner, Leslie Kane, and with Helene Cooper in the 2017 article, Glowing Auras and Black Money, the very famous New York Times piece. Has it changed your life since you wrote that article, Ralph?
Yeah, it sure did. I didn't expect to be spending, the next 8 years or so chasing UFO stories, but there we are.
Yeah, I'm fascinated about how you got into that. I'd love to give people just a little context of your long and illustrious career before we do UFOs. So I'm going to lay out a few things, and you can please correct me if I or AI got this wrong. We have you currently serving as distinguished lecturer at Baruch College of the University of New York. You told me you've been there for about 15 years. You had a long and storied career with the New York Times from 1964 to 2009, holding various roles as foreign correspondent in West Germany, South Vietnam, and Cambodia between 68 and 71, investigative reporting, specializing in corruption and organized crime from 71 to 94. That's a scary and exciting beat. Arts and culture news reporter from 94 to 03. And we have you as the Southwest Bureau Chief, Texas correspondent and Southwest Bureau Chief from 2003 to 2008. Notably, you led the Times Metro team that won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news coverage of the 93 World Trade Center truck bombing. And you also investigated reporting on Nazi war criminals residing in the U.S., which contributed to legislative changes. You've published several books, including Miracle at Sing Sing and The Believer, which is more relevant for our conversational subject today, about John Mack, and people should check that out. It sort of forms a beautiful trilogy with John Mack's two works. I've just been revisiting Believer in the last few days, so I'd love to talk with you about that. So just before we move forward, can you fact check this for me? Did I get these relatively right?
Yeah, it's completely right. Thank you. Good job.
Well, thank you for your service to the project of enlightenment here. This has been a really fascinating and wonderful career. Let's just hop right to the UFOs. What led you to your investigation of UAP in 2017 or the years before that?
Well, I had been working on the John Mack book really since 2004. I was, as you said, I was a bureau chief, Southwest Bureau Chief of the New York Times, based in Houston. And I happened to pick up a copy of John Mack's second book, A Passport to the Cosmos. I had no idea who John Mack was. I was amazed to see that he was a very esteemed Harvard psychiatrist, well-to-do from a pretty fancy family. And he also stumbled across, the UFO and particularly the abduction phenomenon in a way I'm happy to go into. And was writing about it. And I stumbled across his book in Texas, and I thought I would give him a call. It sounded, really interesting that such a prominent professor at Harvard was involved in, alien abduction stories. And I was going to give him a call. And then a few days later, I picked up the New York Times and saw he'd been run over and killed in London. He had gone there for a conference on Lawrence of Arabia. He wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Lawrence. He just looked the wrong way, as Yanks do, in the UK. So I couldn't obviously interview him, but I did. I was intrigued enough to reach out to his family, and they were deeply in mourning, did not want to talk to me. But I persisted, and eventually they agreed, and I got access to his archives. So that started in 2004, and I was working on that book on and off, almost continuously. And then Leslie Kane, who you mentioned was one of my collaborators, told me in 2017 that she'd been to a meeting in Washington, kind of a secret meeting, but she was very well plugged in as a very well esteemed writer of UFOs going way back. And they let her into this meeting, and she found that the Pentagon was still in the UFO business despite its denials. It claimed to have gotten out of UFOs with the end of Project Blue Book in the end of 1969, but it still was monitoring UFOs. It had a secret office in the Pentagon under this guy Luis Elizondo, and Elizondo was quitting because he was unhappy with the way the government was handling his office. So that was the beginning of our times odyssey into UFOs. So that's the short version, and then I'm happy to elaborate.
Okay, great. Well, before we get too deep into the rabbit hole, we should mention also that you wrote a children's book with your wife called UFOs with an OH, and we'll put the link in the description so that people can check that out, because it's a really lovely little fact-based introduction for young, curious minds.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. Thank you.
Yeah, would you like to explain what led you to write the
book? My wife Debbie is a writer of children's books. She's written almost 30 of them on her own.
Wow!
And she heard me doing a lot of interviews for the New York Times UFO story and other stories to come. And she got the idea. She said, "Well, why don't we do a nonfiction UFO book for children?" Because she's a children's book writer. I had never written a children's book. So we collaborated with a very good artist, Adam Gustafson, who had worked with her on another book. And it's all nonfiction. It doesn't talk about aliens because we don't know about aliens. It's about things that are seen in the sky, which the government now admits are real. They're not hallucinations. We don't know what they are, where they come from, why they're here, who's behind the wheel, none of that. But at least thanks to the government now, it's established that these things exist and they do phenomenal things. So we wrote this book and it came out in 2022, I believe, or 23. I'm not sure. Anyway, and we've been doing book fairs and talking about it and talking to children's groups or so, and it's taken on a life of its own. Thank you for mentioning it.
Thank you for writing it. And for parents out there, it's a nice little pickup. It's very simple. It's going to lead down the curious path, but it won't barrage your kid with too much information. And it's not speculative at all, as you just laid out.
So, I mean, kids see so much on TV, and they hear so many stories, and they don't know what to believe. And so if they go to their parents or they go to a librarian and say, "Mommy, UFO is real," parents don't really know what to say. This gives them a starting point for a discussion. And as we say, as I pointed out, it's basically saying what we know, that the government thinks they're real, and tell some stories about them, going back to Roswell, the famous Roswell landing in 1947. So it's a way to bring, to start the conversation going.
Yeah, and invite some curiosity, which is as fascinatingly as all good children's books do. It's kind of a simplified version of something we need to do as adults. I find that useful.
Yeah, what I always say to kids when they come up to us at a book fair, I say, your generation is going to be learning a lot more than we ever knew about this. If you think that a kid is going to live, hopefully into his 80s, let's say, there's a lot of information that this kid is going to be seeing coming out in the years to come. So it's a way of, and I envy them because they're going to find out a lot more than we know.
Well, this kind of gets us close to an interesting subject that comes up it must for you in interacting with people. I've noticed when people ask me, "Oh, you have a UFO podcast," their first question is, "Are they real?" Like, what's up? So UFOs, yes or no, basically is how people ask the question. And so I'm just curious in your conversations like that, how do you introduce people to the subject?
Yeah, it's a common question. And the answer is, since UFO stands for unidentified flying object, or UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. There's no question that there is something out there that's unidentified. So it's clearly real. But we don't know what it is. And, a lot of the information that the government has collected is classified. And that's another problem we had. We were up against, a lot of secrecy. People don't want to go on the record. Whistleblowers are concerned, for their own safety and their non-disclosure agreements they signed with the government. But yeah, they're real. They are real, and that's kind of the breakthrough of the last few years. They're definitely real, but more than that, we really don't know.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about drawing the line between rock solid facts here and speculation. And is that about where you would put it? You'd stop at the R word, they're real, and then question marks after that?
In our reporting for the New York Times, we've been very careful to not to engage in speculation, or if there is speculation, at least we label it as such. But there's been a lot of accounts, stories about recovery of non-human bodies, including in testimony to Congress by David Grush. But again, no one has produced evidence of a body. That information is very closely held by the government. So we've been pretty conservative and careful in our reporting. Everything is on the record. We don't write stories with unnamed sources. That's too easy to do, and readers don't trust it. So Leslie and I and Helene in our first story are very proud of the fact that we put everybody on the record, so people can go back and check our sources. Where we got our information. So, we stick to the facts.
That leads to an interesting side note about sort of sourcing background information. I'm curious about how deep your sources go who don't go on the record. When you write for the Times or for the debrief in 23, you say you've corroborated some of these claims with other unnamed sources, but you don't necessarily reveal every single name of a person that you've talked to. Is that right? Am I understanding that?
That's exactly correct. No reporter, reveals all his or her sources. So we've gotten information, tons of information, on background, off the record, but we don't report that. In other words, we don't use that as the basis for a story. What we'll do is try to get it confirmed by somebody on the record. But we have really some outstanding sources and information from deep inside these programs, and we believe certain things that we've heard, but not to the point where we can put them out in a story. So we're constantly trying to corroborate things, get people to go on the record and talk to us. So we hear all kinds of things, and some of it is pretty amazing.
That's interesting. So it sounded like what I just heard you say was that you have learned some information you think that you're not able to deeply confirm yet, and as a result, you haven't published that information. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
Fascinating. Anything you'd care to share?
Well, I mean, the big question out there is, has the government recovered non-human technology from any of these crashed objects, including possible bodies? What has the analysis of these items shown? Things like that. These stories have been floating around for a long time. They're all over the internet. As I say, the internet is full of information that is intriguing, but because it's unsourced, you don't know how to check it. So that's the trick. But there's amazing information floating around, and despite the secrecy of the government, there are accounts that I would say seem pretty credible of things that happen, crashes and recoveries, but not to the point where we can put them in a story with our names on it.
Have you read some of these less sourced or unproven threads online, say like a Reddit thread or a 4chan thread from people who say, I'm in the program and I can't verify that?
Yeah, all the time, all the
yeah.
time. I mean, I've particularly followed a lot of the abduction accounts. I mean, this is what John Mack specialized in. People came forward from all walks of life, men, women, children, all over the world, not just in America, with amazing stories about encounters with alien beings. I've interviewed quite a number of these people myself.
Really?
Oh yeah, and but again, the problem is, I could give their names. Some of them have gone on the record, but there's no proof of what they encountered. You know, I can identify them as by name and tell their whole story, but they don't have any proof. They believe that these things happened in some kind of reality, not a reality we can always recognize. And John Mack believed the same thing, but he also knew that by the standards of proof that science demands, we can't prove it. Nobody has come back with a confirmed photo of an alien, or artifacts of a body of an alien, or any of that. So that, by the way, is really part of the phenomenon. It seems to relish its elusiveness. So it's not just an accident that no proof has emerged. It seems to be central to whatever phenomenon this is, that it evades pinning down. I mean, people have set up cameras, at night to see or to catch a picture of these, entities that they say have appeared to them at night, but either the camera malfunctions or the pictures don't come out. So that's an interesting aspect of this whole thing.
It's so bizarre. It reminds you of like a horror movie or something where the
it is, and to many people it is. It's almost always a horrible experience, mingled with some other things that John Mack found out about. I mean, kind of elation, and there's a kind of a feeling of communing with the ineffable, or touching God and all that. But also very traumatic, and some of these people are deeply traumatized, many of them.
Yeah, and Mack largely, it seemed to me, decided that this trauma tended to be the result of the experience rather than predating the experience. Part of his work, like ruling out whether trauma could be considered a factor for reporting abduction.
Yeah, that's a good point. That, a lot of people, by the way, there are a lot of people who pretend to understand this phenomenon and who are quick to, the so-called skeptics, who are quick to have an answer. Oh, this is a sexual trauma that has been, transmigrated into an alien memory, etc. But these people don't really know what they're talking about. John Mack was a psychiatrist. He understood at least the principles of psychiatry. And he looked for another explanation. He would have loved to find an explanation that was conventional. But as you say, I mean, people who've had sexual traumas, and some of the people who come forward with abduction stories have suffered sexual trauma, because it's a cross section, and everybody has some trauma that they've, suffered under. But these things, these traumas that they actually experienced, had nothing to do with the abduction experience that they recounted. So it's not an easy explanation. As I say, some of the skeptics will have you believe, oh, this is a, sleep apnea. People are waking up in the middle of the night and they believe that that this nightmare is real. All these explanations don't wash. They don't come to grips with the central mystery. And if you're going to be a skeptic, at least, go into the literature and understand why these simple explanations don't hold water.
Complicating the picture, there are also genuine hoaxes. There are,
and Mack was stung by one. Actually, I tell about it in my book. A woman came forward and got him to believe a wild story about she was on a spaceship during the Cuban Missile Crisis with Nikita Khrushchev and Castro, and and Mack, who had heard a lot of stories, ate it up. I mean, he was just so he was programmed basically to listen to the craziest of stories. But the weirdest thing is, as I point out in the book, the woman who came forward with a story and then later reneged and told Time magazine that she made it all up, and it hurt John Mack deeply, resulted in a big investigation at Harvard. But I point out convincingly in the book that she probably did have some real abduction experiences that she was covering up, which she had talked about long before she met John Mack.
She met Whitley Strieber the year before.
Yeah, it's not simple. But you're absolutely right. There are hoaxers out there. There are people who tell stories for a living. And that's one of the things that has to be separated out.
Let's talk a little bit more about John Mack. Your book is wonderful. You paint a really pretty unflinching portrait of this guy. We get a lot of in-depth personal presence in his life, and not least probably because you had access to his journals and really his most intimate personal thoughts. So you take an unflinching look at the man and his life. And I think probably skeptics and enthusiasts would both find a rewarding, rich field of material in this work, which I understand was the result of some 17 years of work on your part.
Yeah,
right?
Between from the beginning of when I picked up that book, Passport to the Cosmos, to the final version of the book printed. 17 years. It was, you never think when you start on a project like this, it's going to take that long. But, you're right. I mean, I did find some very human parts of John Mack's story. He was not faithful to his wife. He was interested in other women. He was sometimes gullible, but he was honest. He grappled with all these questions, looking for a simple explanation, which there wasn't. And he was very human, which is what I liked about him. I mean, he was not a cardboard cutout who, was some make-believe hero. He was a real person who suffered doubts and setbacks, and the Joseph Campbell mythos of the hero. The hero's journey, I said at the end of the book, really figures into John Mack's story. It's like an ordinary person who's given a task that he doesn't want to fulfill because he knows it's going to be difficult and arduous and dangerous, which it was. And yet he did all those things. He had all these adventures. He had all these setbacks. And he came back with a boon, a reward for all mankind, which is knowledge. But he was a real person. He was not just a cartoonish figure.
He seemed to have an almost radical empathy to some extent. Like if you watch just the footage of him in Rua, Zimbabwe, talking to those kids and being present for them, seemed like part of his work was being very open, holding openness in these conversations with people, reporting strange experiences so that they felt safe sharing them somewhere, and that he didn't necessarily bring a judgment to. It seemed like he was trying not to bring any preconceived judgment to those interactions. I wonder, after almost 20 years and now more than 20 years of thinking about it and living with this material, have you landed with certainty on one side of the fence? Do you feel, how do you feel about the reality of the underlying claims, I guess is what I'm.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a very good question. I would say I've gotten more confused. It seemed almost clearer when I got into it. And for John Mack, the same thing happened. When he heard these stories and interviewed the people, he not immediately, but quickly believed that these people were credible. I mean, he ruled out all the things we just talked about, that they were looking to cash in on their experience because they were deeply ashamed, actually, of what happened to them, even though they weren't responsible. And they weren't making it up, because everybody was basically telling similar stories, not word for word, but similar. So, and people from all walks of life, all parts of the globe, were telling similar stories, and even little children were telling similar stories. The kids who had never read a book about UFOs, they'd never been to a movie about UFOs. Some of the kids were as young as 2 years old, and they said, at night, little man, take me up in the sky. So Mack was almost predisposed in the beginning to believe these accounts literally. Later, he became more confused, because he saw that there were other paranormal experiences, like survival of consciousness or life after death, like crop circles, like precognition, knowing things before they happen. So he saw that there was a whole vast field of strange experiences that can't be explained by conventional physics or conventional psychology. And I would say I'm in the same category. I'm more confused than ever, because none of the quick explanations, answer the real questions. And I have to come back to it. It's a mystery, and I think we have to pay tribute to that fact that it is a mystery. We have various hypotheses. Yeah, maybe they're aliens. They come from another planet. Maybe, people consciousness survives death. Maybe all these things, but we're not any closer to finding out whether they're true or not.
It is data of a kind that people who spend years and years with this subject tend to migrate from the nuts and bolts starting point to more of a spiritual understanding of the nature of reality later. And holding both of those in your mind simultaneously can be challenging. I would say one of the poster children for this is Jacques Vallée, whose work has encompassed both of these ideas. And Jacques has been sort of steadfast in saying it's not either. It's probably both. And that's starting to seem right to me, which as an ontological challenge is somewhat enormous. Right. You could sort of onboard aliens at one level of like accepting or an update to our reality worldview, but accepting that there might be a spirit realm as well. That's a whole other kit and or caboodle.
It gets more and more complicated, and that's why John actually broke away from two of his colleagues, Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, who were pioneers with him, at least in researching the phenomenon. And talking to people who had and suffered these experiences or had these encounters. But Jacobs and Hopkins, basically, Hopkins is dead. Jacobs is still alive, but older. They believe that these things happened in a everyday reality, that these things actually happened, these experiences. And John Mack wasn't so sure. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it's got to be happening in some liminal, some strange borderline state that's not here nor there. And again, it defies easy explanation. Those who say, well, clearly these spaceships are coming down and kidnapping humans, for experiments. Well, why aren't they seen and documented on film? I mean, it's happening in some strange in-between state. And yet the accounts of the people are very persuasive. I spend a lot of time in the book on Betty and Barney Hill, the first famous abduction, a couple who were traveling in the White Mountains in New Hampshire in the 60s, and had this whole encounter where they later remembered that they'd been taken aboard a ship and subject to all these experiments and procedures.
And they have some physical evidence in their case. I mean, there's like the tear on the zipper of her dress, for example.
There was.
Mud on shoes.
Yeah, very interesting that it did come with some, proof, you could say, or at least evidence that people can examine. And the whole archive is at the University of New Hampshire in Durham. The family of Betty Hill including Kathleen Marsden, who's a niece, and she's written her own books, a very learned and dogged investigator. The family has put all these items into the archive, including the what do you call it? Psychiatric evaluations of the psychiatrist they saw, not John Mack, but another very reputable psychiatrist. So that information is there for anyone who wants to take the time to study it. But I can tell you this, I'll save you a lot of time and trouble. You're not going to be convinced at the end either, because it just leaves you hanging.
Yeah. There's no smoking gun.
There's no smoking gun, maybe by design.
I want to ask you about both of those things, the by design and the smoking gun. First, to the smoking gun, have you seen any or done any follow-up research about any of the pregnancy claims, or that seems, it just jumped out to me as a potential place for a paper trail if people had a pregnancy and then it ended mysteriously with no child, or if there was, a fetus removed or something. Those seem like events that might have some kind of crossover with the medical records world. Have you tracked down any of those leads?
I have not, because I saw early on that these efforts to pin something down for sure were mostly doomed to failure for one reason or another. You put your finger on something. You would think that a woman who claimed she was pregnant by an alien, was carrying a hybrid child, and then she was re-abducted. In other words, she was abducted. She had sex with an alien, impregnated. She was pregnant with this hybrid alien, and then she was re-abducted, and the pregnancy was removed. The fetus was removed to be raised as an alien. You would think that would lend itself to some kind of verification. You could find a doctor, you could, get the medical records. It doesn't work that way. There's always a reason why the medical records are not there. The woman didn't remember the name of the doctor, or the doctor didn't remember the case, or the case, the records disappeared, or no one will provide the records. In other words, as far as I know, there are no records verifying the fact that a woman was undeniably pregnant and then mysteriously, not through miscarriage, but through some other process, the pregnancy was removed. Again, you could spend your whole life trying to nail down those stories, and you probably are not going to be able to do it. So to answer your question, no, I haven't really spent a lot of time. I did try to see if there was a quick way to confirm any of those stories. And like all the other, alien stories, they kind of dissipate into the fog and mist.
Okay. Well, speaking of mistiness, another one on this subject, what do you make of the hypnosis? And in your interviews with some experiencers, have you talked to people who had conscious surface memories, or is everyone that you talked to and who worked with John Mack revealing this information in some sort of kind of like suspended or relaxed state? I know John Mack was a little bit hesitant to use the word hypnosis. He didn't think of it as like a deep trance state necessarily, and that wasn't what he was going for.
No, I mean, I've talked to people who have very vivid, real memories, memories of their abduction experiences. So it's not only, in relaxation techniques or hypnosis, which, as you point out, John Mack wasn't really an advocate of hypnosis because he didn't trust it completely. But he certainly himself practiced relaxation techniques, and it evoked things in himself. He experienced going back in time to his own birth. He said he remembered, he felt it. His mother, who died when he was 8 months old, he was basically in touch with her through this experience. So, but these people do not only remember these experiences or recount these experiences in states of hypnosis or relaxation. They're very vivid to them. They say, Ralph, this is as clear to me as I'm talking to you right now. This was not in a dream state. This was not a nightmare. I know what nightmares are, and Mack studied nightmares, so he knew what nightmares were. People say this happened to me as clear as I'm telling you this right now.
Wow.
So it is not, to answer your question, it's not just in hypnosis or relaxation procedures that they recount these memories. Sometimes they come back to people because their memories, in many cases actually, are wiped. There's a famous abduction case that I talk about a little bit in the book, in the Allagash swamp of Maine. Talk about a creepy place.
Yeah.
And I met those guys. There were 3 fishermen, 2 brothers and friends who went fishing, and they had a UFO encounter in the swamps of Maine. But after it happened, they went back to the campsite and went to sleep, and they woke up, and nobody ever mentioned it. And then it came back years later to several of the participants, and they questioned each other and said, "Do you remember what happened that night on the lake?" And some basically did, and some didn't. But so that's another part of the mystery, that there's a kind of a difficulty in recapturing these things, but others remember them like it was yesterday.
I've heard those stories from a couple other people, the mixed memory by a group. Some people remember, some people don't, and years can go by and something triggers it. Fascinating, just sort of from a consciousness standpoint. Also, it seems to me like we can't leave the experience or conversation without just noting that if this turns out to be real, then we kind of owe the biggest possible societal apology to this large group of people who have been experiencing something like this and just swept to the side and ridiculed and minimized.
They are. And John Mack went on TV, Oprah, among other shows, with some of these people.
Yeah, good for Oprah, by the way.
Yeah, they were subject to terrible abuse. These people, they were ridiculed and made fun of. And it took a lot of courage for them to come forward and talk about their stories.
I would put this on the short list of reasons that it's pressing for us to make some progress societally. It would be great to understand, the physics and whether there's a galactic club, but it would also be just a human service to our fellow people.
Because these people are as confused, or more confused than anybody. Again, it's not like they're looking to come forward to tell their story. They're eager to tell their story to make money. They hide the story because they're ashamed for some reason, because they know no one's going to believe them and people will look down on them. So you're absolutely right. These people have borne a tremendous stigma over the years.
Are you aware of centers doing contemporary versions of John Mack's work, like ongoing scientific interaction or medical interaction with experiencers?
That's a good question. Not much. I think, first of all, there's been no central figure like John Mack who's been courageous enough to come forward. Certainly nobody like Harvard, a place like that. So, there are people who are carrying on research and writing books and things like that. But Mack was unique in that sense that he was a public personality who relished the limelight. I mean, he was not only not afraid of it, he enjoyed the notoriety. And I'm not aware of anybody quite like that today.
You say there are people doing research. Do you mean mostly on the archival data, like at the Archives of the Impossible from Mack and Hopkins's work?
They're like people like Jacques Vallée and Gary Nolan at Stanford, who is examining actually the brains of people who experience stories to see how they might have been physically affected.
That's a good point. And Gary Nolan has found some evidence.
Is a perfect example of a very reputable scientist who is deeply into the question of finding some probing, for proof of effects of interactions. And actually, there's been a couple of cases where the government did pay for people who were harmed by exposure to UFOs. A case in the forest in England.
Rendlesham.
Rendlesham Forest. I think a guy named John Burroughs, is it, who was a witness there and later put in a claim for damage that he suffered as in proximity to the object that he witnessed, and the government eventually paid a claim for his injury. So that's a notable case. Then there was a whole the question of all the Havana syndrome and people who've been hurt by that. That's a similar mystery. Maybe related. But people who have suffered encounters with some entity or some weapon or something, and no one can figure out what it is.
I'd like to double click into the military world in just a moment, but one more side note just to ask you about the Men in Black. Do you have feelings, theories, ideas about the Men in Black?
I've heard those stories, and they are amazing. I think Whitley Strieber, who I may see in New York in a couple of days.
Oh, great.
I kept in touch with him. His book, Communion, is really one of the first accounts, and very brave. I mean, he wrote down what he said happened to him and his family at their cottage in Massachusetts. A very strange series of events, encounters that he said left him deeply traumatized. He still is traumatized. Now he has, podcasts and books. Anyway, he's a real pioneer. And how did we get on this?
Men in Black.
Men in Black. So I think he told the story of being in a bookstore or so, and he saw two figures huddling over his book, Communion, and laughing and pointing, digging each other in the ribs and laughing about it. And they were just very strange people. He said, and then they kind of, disappeared when they saw he was watching them. I've heard many accounts like that of people who, including from some skeptics, by the way. I remember talking to a woman who wrote a book, who was not a particular UFO enthusiast, who told me of some encounter in an airport. She was just sitting next to a guy who seemed to know a lot about her and her research. And she later on, she really puzzled over who was this person, and then disappeared. So I've not had any experiences with Men in Black or UFOs or any sightings or abduction experiences of my own, just like John Mack did not have. Yet I've heard these stories, and they are very, very troubling and affecting, and especially because they're so detailed. They're not like vague, nightmare stories or so. They're very specific about these encounters. And again, it's part of the mystery. Are these alien beings who come to Earth to, engage with humans? Who are these people? Are they government agents? But, again, mystery.
And the government agent assumption is what I brought to the field just a couple years ago, knowing nothing about it. I always associated the idea of Men in Black with, like the deep state, CIA, FBI types, NSA.
Well, except, when
stories are not like that.
There's one story I'm trying to remember. I think I have it in my book about a guy who was visited, who had some encounter and experiences, and then he was visited by two strange characters, Men in Black, they often dressed in black, and
they often tend to pop up in pairs in these stories.
Yeah, in pairs, and the guy's story was he went to do something in the kitchen, or he was going to get something, and a voice popped up in his head. Stay out of this, or something like that. So there are all these stories of people who have very vivid memories of encounters, but these people then fade away. They arrive in a brown car, and they're dressed all in brown or in black. And anyway, to answer your question, no, I have no wisdom to bring to bear on this.
Yeah, me either, except that it's fascinating. And it's kind of easy to imagine an evasive presence that is just trying not to be seen. It's much harder to imagine a non-human being putting a suit on and getting in a Buick or something,
Right.
driving to a place and saying, "Stop following this lead."
Yeah.
Like strange
Yeah.
language and anachronistic phrases and things. Is another one that pops up, or not blinking, or being just
Yeah.
like of a weird height, and that this is like a really persistent piece of reporting, and it is one of the weirder parts of the story landscape.
Just when you think you've heard the weirdest story there is,
Yeah,
someone comes along with a weirder one.
yeah,
And again, these are not kind of stories that you think anyone could make up. When you read the accounts of people, being put in like sealed in glass tubes for interstellar voyages, and sitting in liquid. I mean, again, they're so specific,
yeah.
and so bizarre and so unearthly, literally. You wonder who could make this stuff up. It's just amazing.
That's a good point. And I skeptics would say, there's been some evidence that you can inspire people to make up pretty compelling, detailed, weird stuff, in a state of hypnosis, or, just even a state of creativity. So that,
well, you mentioned that. It's true. There was one study I remember now, where the question to the participants was, make up a completely outlandish story about an abduction or something like that. Just make it up. And they made it up, and it was pretty close to some of the other stories of people who remembered actual abductions. So the experiment was said to conclude that people can make up these stories. So it adds to the mystery. It's not completely out of the question that people can make up stories that turn out to be pretty mysterious. So again, it doesn't answer, it doesn't solve, the riddle. It just complicates it.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about trying to solve the riddle here now in our last 10 minutes. As an experienced hand, I'm wondering what advice you have for people who are working to get toward the truth of this. And let's especially focus on your realm of expertise in journalism. If you're talking to a young crop of journalists that are just starting out, shining their shoes and getting ready, what should they do? How should they approach this topic?
Good question.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I mean, in our reporting, Leslie and I, and with Helene in the first story, we stuck to traditional journalism. So you ask questions, you find people who are, experts in one way or another, people who either had experiences or have studied, and run down all the leads. First of all, the government knows a lot more than it is saying. There's a lot of information that remains classified, including possibly recovered craft, possibly recovered bodies, reverse engineered technology. So information is there. We just can't get at it because it's classified. So I would say anyone who's interested in following this field, just find the people who are doing the work. People in the government are not talking; they're very hard to get. And people in private industry, where it was probably even closer to the solution of this mystery, are especially not talking because they're not amenable to freedom of information, and they're not responsible as government employees are in terms of responding to the people, right? To queries from the public. Private industry just will not talk, period. And that's where a lot of the information, I think, is buried in private companies now. But I think, again, not to be intimidated, reporters should not be intimidated by the fact that a lot of it is still classified. Find people, ask questions, try to get some of the whistleblowers to come forward. There's a lot of people out there like David Grush and Jake Barber, the guy who more recently. So there are whistleblowers. A lot of them are not coming forward because they're afraid, because the whistleblower statute didn't protect them as it was supposed to. They've still been harassed and threatened. So good reporting is good reporting. And I think the more that, and now happily, there are people in Congress who are taking it upon themselves to ask questions, to probe and to push, which was not the case before. Congress has held 2 or 3 hearings, which have really advanced the ball. Not a lot, still a lot of problems, but more than before. So I would say, ask questions, find sources. It's very hard because this is the biggest, deepest held secret of all time in the government, more than the Manhattan Project, more than the atomic bomb, you name it. This thing is so covered up under layers of secrecy. Presidents don't know about it. Some presidents have been briefed, but probably not in great depth. It's stovepiped in different, special programs.
So one agency might not even know about the activities of another
and
agency.
People who know ain't talking. And there are relatively few people involved, I believe. It's not widely known in the government. And when the Pentagon spokesman comes out and says, I'm not aware of any product, that person is probably telling the truth. That
they may
person
not be
is
aware.
Not aware.
Right.
They wouldn't be aware.
Yes.
Because it's not information that's widely shared. It's very, very closely held, deeply secret. The government has lied about it for many, many years, going back to the 40s. So it's not easy. And editors are very resistant to the subject. So that's another problem. Ask for advice of reporters. They're going to encounter a lot of skepticism among editors or disinterest. So it's not a great way to make your reputation, or get rich. It's a very difficult field.
Thank you for that. Let's click up one level and give some advice to those editors now. Maybe they're more seasoned, more established. They're looking at a bigger picture here. And I want to fold in 2 more elements here that are a little thorny, so I'm not going to ask the question perfectly. Maybe you can help me. One, I'm thinking about your point about government denials and military denials. I spoke with Leslie about the fact that there are programs that are so secret that they require people who know about them to dissemble if they are asked publicly, which is extremely challenging from a reporting standpoint, because you want to just report the facts, and the facts are, well, Sue Goff told us that there's nothing to see here, or she said Arrow is not aware of any activity in another agency. To your point, I think about that a lot. And then I also want to follow this thread. You mentioned private companies like Lockheed and maybe Boeing. People have gone to these companies and asked for statements. And one statement they got last year, I believe, or maybe the year before, was questions about UAP are best addressed to the US government, which is not a denial, and kind of critically not a denial, because it would be easy for them to say, we don't have any recovered UFOs.
They won't even talk about it, right?
Yeah. So I guess the way to put a tip on the spear here and phrase it as a question is, how do you think about the role of logic in the project of reporting and the project of sort of editorial management of reporting? Is there a way to get past these simple denials and bring in sort of negative evidence, like, well, Lockheed could have said this, but they didn't. So that inspires me to ask the following questions. How do you think about logic in reporting about UAP?
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question. I think, first of all, I think it's very important to parse the language that official spokespeople use. And as you pointed out, if they say Arrow is not aware of maybe somebody in Arrow or associated with Arrow is aware, but Arrow itself is not aware, supposedly, according to this, locution. So you have to be very, very careful about how you interpret the statements. Often the people making the statements, the spokespeople, are not read into the programs, so they don't know, and they're just saying what they're told to say, and maybe an outright lie. But it can be construed as this person is not aware, who you're speaking to is not him or herself aware of these programs, which is entirely understandable. They're very, very closely held. But the government over the years has out and out lied. It has. Um, the people who really know about it are very, very few. They're very deeply sequestered. They are under all kinds of secrecy, statutes. And I mean, even Lou Elizondo, who has gone public in a really dramatic way in his book, which we broke in the New York Times, breaks a lot of new ground. He's not telling everything he knows by a long shot. He's very careful what he says because he's under wraps still. He's an intelligence guy from way back, and he signed a lot, agreements. And there's certain things he can say and certain things he can't say. So I would say, to answer your question, to just be very, very skeptical and literal about anything anyone in the government says, and be aware that the people talking to you in the government, the people speaking for the government, are not really the people who know the ins and outs of what's going on. And if they did, they wouldn't tell you. And the reason that they're spokespeople is that they don't know a lot. They are kept there to give, some kind of an official account that what they may themselves believe or what they're told to say, but they're not the right people to talk to. If you had your druthers who you would really want to talk to, you'd want to talk to people in special access programs, certain people who know, but those people are very well hidden, and they're under all kinds of restrictions. So you're not going to be talking to them. So it's kind of a catch-22.
Careful logic and being aware of the deep iceberg are some ideas I took away there. I'm sensitive to your time now. I just want to ask, as we close out, is there anything you'd like to put a gloss on, returning to the broad topic here, things you'd like to see happen in the next few years, how we should all keep our head on straight as we navigate this challenging information environment, or just anything else that you're thinking about in the broad area of this subject to bring us to a close?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, we're proceeding methodically. We, Leslie and I, other people doing this kind of work, George Knapp, Jeremy Corbell, others, Ross Coulthart, are all, probing, asking the right questions, digging out sources, doing the right thing. And I think you asked about editors. I think editors really have to open up a little more and be less. There's a deep skepticism among many editors, not all, about this whole field. And I mean, editors are supposed to be skeptical. They're paid to be skeptical, but some of them are just hostile to this information, and they're not aware. Again, they're not experts. They're not aware of how much has actually come out already, or what people have said, and the state of knowledge. So there is a lot of new information coming out that makes the subject more transparent and more amenable to public discussion. So I think, again, you start and end with the idea that this is a mystery. Nobody has an answer. And anyone who says they have an answer, you shouldn't believe, because nobody knows. And the people with answers, not the answer maybe, but with some answers, they're not the ones coming forward, and they're not the ones you're going to be able to interview. So it's a little bit of, little steps at a time to get a little more information out. I don't believe that there's such a thing coming as so-called, disclosure with a big D, that the government is suddenly going to say, okay, we're going to put everything out there that we know. That's not going to happen. But I think little by little, Congress is motivated, is energized now, at least some people in Congress, and they want answers, because a lot of this research, which, by the way, some of this research is not national security information. I mean, the existence of a new kind of physics or new materials that would revolutionize warfare, that could be, properly secret, okay, in terms of national security information that the government can and should protect, okay, from adversaries. But other information, like encounters with, alien intelligence, that deserves to be shared with humanity. So this, not everything is secret, or at least we are not asking for disclosure of chemical compositions of this material. Just the fact that material has been found that is not of earthly origin would be a breakthrough for the government to admit. So I think that that's the issue, that more information can be properly shared with the public, and should be, because this is what, humanity deserves. But again, nations are, very wrapped up in their own security, and any nation that would solve the mystery of propulsion of these objects, power sources, how they're able to do what they do, which is extraordinary, would control the future of the world, no doubt about it. And every country would want to be in that position. So you could say there is a proper interest for every country for itself into pursuing that information. But other information, such as, are we alone in the universe, that stops well short of, methods and scientific formulas and things like that. That information, I think, should be shared among the peoples of the world, because they're the ones who would benefit and who would suffer any the consequences if we're not alone in the universe. It might not be a benign universe after all. So, but it's a long, slow process.
I agree with you that we deserve to know as much of the truth as we can figure out. And I'm personally looking forward to keeping my eyes peeled for your byline to get some more interesting facts about this fascinating situation. And I hope people will go check out UFOs for their kids and Believer very much for adults. So I just want to say again, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today, Ralph. It's been an honor to meet you, and I'm very grateful for your work. So thank you so much for everything you do.
Thanks, Caleb. It's been a real pleasure. You have great questions, and keep the dialogue going. Thank you.
And that's the show. Thank you for watching or listening. If you'd like to subscribe to the show, you can do that on patreon.com/WTUFO or on YouTube or on Buzzsprout. You can support us for as much or as little per month as you would like to. We really appreciate anything that you can contribute. Also, you can check out Spacefair's shop at spacefair.etsy.com. Thank you again for watching or listening. I hope you have a beautiful day.